everybody, I am the Indoor Adventurer. You are watching Simple and Keen, and today we are going to be talking about how censorship as a result of religious fervor and copyright infringement in the 1980s ended up contributing to the creation of several creatures and races within the world of Dungeons and Dragons. Perhaps the most famous of these instances of censorship came from the period of time that tabletop gamers and comic readers would know as the Satanic Panic. Even though it's very easy to disregard the mindset of these worried religious families, their concerns were also being preyed upon by media outlets and others seeking that same kind of spotlight. TSR experienced further pressure from the media as a string of murders and suicides occurring during this time all possessed a common thread, in that all of those involved directly with these various incidents all played Dungeons and Dragons. Heading this movement was one Patricia Pulling, whose son had committed suicide after she claimed he had received a curse while playing his favorite tabletop game. Pulling even went so far as to take TSR to court over her son's death, but ultimately the case was dismissed as many of her claims were disputed by individuals like Michael A. Stackpole, who found that gamers actually had lower suicide rates than their non-gamer counterparts. While we are able to look back on this period of time with our lens of hindsight, we can actually see multiple studies that all show that D&D and other tabletop games help exercise critical thinking, social skills, leadership, on top of encouraging the use of imagination, which is important in the idea of free play amongst youths. To avoid further combating the riled-up religious groups that had spawned during the Satanic Panic of the 1980s, we can actually see the changes made to Dungeons & Dragons that were a result of wanting to distance themselves from the previously mentioned controversy. As in the second edition of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, most all references to demons, devils, and other potentially controversial creatures have been removed. I was actually astonished looking through both the first and second edition of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons as I realized that these demons and devils no longer filled the pages of the monstrous manual, and in their place we had the Batezu and the Tenari, and even the name of those with lycanthropy changed to become the Antherion. However, what we get from this transition was actually very masterfully done on behalf of TSR. While they could have simply swept the entirety of both demons and devils under the rug, the creators of Dungeons & Dragons expanded upon the lore of these distinct creatures by giving an origin story to these now unmentionable creatures. The Tanar'ri, formerly demons, now had their origin tied to a race of creatures called the Oberith, who would actually just turn out to be more demons, but just of a higher power threshold. And while not the most flush with information by any means, the brief description of the hierarchy of creatures made from pure chaos actually makes for some pretty interesting lore. Because a lot of the Eurocentric mythos that Dungeons & Dragons utilizes, we as consumers have bought into this idea that demons and devils are very similar, as they both represent a form of evil within the good and evil spectrum. However, in tabletop games, demons aren't always bipedal, red-skinned, horned creatures with wings, so I feel like TSR distancing themselves from these kinds of generic demons really played out well in terms of creating content, as they were no longer limiting themselves to what was possible in reality. No longer being limited to the stylization of a humanoid, the Tanar'ri could be anything that the Dungeon Master wanted them to be. As your players wander through the infinite layers of the Abyss, the home of the demons in the cosmology of Dungeons & Dragons, they could meet a Tanar'ri that was a sentient green ooze capable of surviving whatever layer it found itself on. Perhaps they encounter a giant-sized creature with 4 arms, wings, and a mouth on its abdomen, and now they have to face a creature of legendary horror. Or, worse yet, your players come face to face with the Oberith that had originally controlled any of these abominations during their time in the Abyss. Even though demons had gotten all but removed from the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Monstrous Manual, they still gained a decent bit in terms of lore, and in the late 1990s, we actually see the chains of controversy lifted from the game with the publication of The Guide to Hell, which gives an incredibly detailed look into the structure of the Nine Hells, and I would highly suggest checking it out if you or your players have any sort of interest or relation to the plane of Bator. While the Satanic Panic initially caused demons and devils to recede back into the shadows, much in a similar fashion, the resurgence of these creatures after the public spectacle died down caused them to come back stronger than ever before. From the lowly Lemure to the ferocious Baelor, the world of Dungeons & Dragons now contains a variety of malicious creatures that a dungeon master can fill their campaign with. This would not be the only time that censorship would lead to creative decisions though, as once again we get to look at the Baelor, Treants, and the entire race of halflings. As you might guess while looking at these creatures, they share a striking resemblance to a certain other creative property. And while these kinds of changes seem like the difference between Under Pressure by Queen and David Bowie and Ice Ice Baby by Vanilla Ice,
Ding 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 ding. Ding ding ding. That's the way theirs goes. Ours goes ding 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 ding. Ding 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 ding.
the creation of halflings, treants, and Baelors is actually tied to the love that Gygax and the game's other co-creator Dave Arneson had for the creations of J.R.R. Tolkien. When looking at the old Dragon magazines from the 70s, we can see blatant references to the Lord of the Rings. Since Dungeons & Dragons was originally based on modifications made to old miniature-based war games, it was only a matter of time before rules and modules were made for things like the Battle of the Five Armies, or for large encounters like with a Balrog. Once the ball started rolling in terms of success for Dungeons & Dragons, however, they quickly had to distance themselves from blatantly taking the intellectual property of another license, as they did not have the cognitive dissonance that our dear friend Mr. Ice had in regards to his creative process.
Ding 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 ding. Ding 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 ding.
While the Baelor was easily fit into the category of demons and the Treant was lumped into the same category of forest dwellers such as the Dryad or other fey creatures, the Halfling was left out of the majority of this. While creatures such as the elves, dwarves, and even the gnomes have a very definitive origin story, the Halflings were simply transported over to Dungeons & Dragons without any kind of origin to help solidify them in the world's lore. Even in the newly released Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes, we are only given a glimpse into the everyday life of the Halfling, but not the lore or history around their origin. While a clever DM could certainly manufacture an origin story based on the idea that once millions of years ago there were full-lings, but due to some reason or another they became halflings. Or perhaps they were a race of humans millions of years ago that ended up becoming the favored kin of a particular deity and have since become transformed into the halflings that we know today. It is because of this flexibility that I feel like there is a lot that you could possibly do with halflings in Dungeons & Dragons, simply because they don't have an origin that is set in stone in the same way as a dwarf. While we can certainly see the initial influence that censorship had on removing references to a subset of creatures in earlier editions of Dungeons & Dragons, I feel like their absence during the mid-80s until the late 90s did wonders in terms of really taking the time to flesh out the lore of the demons and devils that we have come to know. Now, rather than being the remnants of religious rhetoric, the demonic Tanar'ri had their own ecology and mythos, and their own origin now part of the self-sustaining world of Dungeons & Dragons. The same can be said for the devilish inhabitants of Baator, for while it was similar in the creation of hell in the Abrahamic religions like Christianity, Judaism, or Islam, the creators of Dungeons & Dragons spent time and effort creating the 9 hells to distance themselves from the original wave of satanic panic that had crept over the United States in the 1980s. Players can even have their characters be part of a half-devil race known as the Tieflings, and Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes actually has an expanded list of lineages that you can be based off of the lords of these 9 hells, which not only allows for further customization of your character, but also gives the player more history into the ecology and structure that previously would have been avoided like the plague. Before I go, I just wanted to say thank you once again to everyone that has helped get the word out about this channel, and to those who have contributed ideas or topics for upcoming videos. I love hearing what you guys have to say, so feel free to leave your thoughts and comments below, and remember, keep your wits sharp and your blades sharper.